From the boardroom to the metaverse, this is the Meta Business Podcast. I, Paul Dewalibi, the master of the metaverse, will lead you through the biggest business stories in the metaverse. Join us as we break down the news and trends from a C-suite lens, bringing you insights, analysis, and discussion that you can't find anywhere else every single week. Welcome to Meta Business. Welcome to episode 3 of the Meta Business Podcast. I am Paul Dewalibi, master of the metaverse. I'm joined today by my friend, my co-host, Jeff the Juice Cohen. Jeff, how's it going? How you doing this week?
Hey, Paul. I'm doing well. I'm excited to get in here. Week 3. You know, we're getting the kinks out. I think we're hitting the ground running. I'm excited to jump in.
Well-oiled machine by now.
Yeah.
I apologize for my very kind of kitschy backdrop green screen here. I am not in our studio. I am not at home even. And so this is as good and as metaversey as you're going to get, right? You're going to have to deal with this very metaversey background. Although I don't know why neon blue and pink is like metaverse.
Would you say it almost feels like we're in the metaverse currently? You know, this might be the metaverse.
At least the folks at PC Gamer might agree with you, which we will get to because there was an interesting article that they wrote calling the metaverse bullshit. Which I don't agree with, and I'm pretty sure you don't agree with, but you calling this call here metaverse might agree with.
We'll get into that one, but I don't agree with it. I think I would get thrown off the podcast here if I did, but I think he makes some good points wrapped around a lot of bluster and clickbaity language. But I think we'll get into that. I don't know if that's the first topic, but we can get into that one later.
No, let's start with which I think is the big kind of business metaverse news this week, because it was one of the biggest gaming companies in the world sort of making a pretty big announcement here. And I'll put this up on screen here so you can see it. The headline is, and this was directly from the press release from Ubisoft. It says, introducing Ubisoft Quartz, the first platform for playable and energy efficient NFTs in AAA games. Now, the article goes on to say that Ubisoft Quartz is a new platform for players to acquire digits, the first NFTs playable in a AAA game running on energy-efficient technology. They're going to launch in beta with Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon Breakpoint, and digits will be released as part of limited editions, each composed of a fixed number of cosmetic items. Now, the press release goes on to explain how digits create sort of more value because they're unique. They're a unique collectible that feature their own serial number that can be seen in game. They're playable, so there's active utility value. And each digit comes with a certificate of ownership stored on blockchain, independent from Ubisoft. And so it's not bound to your game inventory. They can put it, according to this press release, players can put these items for sale on third-party platforms outside of the Ubisoft ecosystem. So Ubisoft sort of following through here, right? Right, Jeff, like on what they said they were going to do.
I will say, yeah, before we dive into what we think about we do have to give a lot of credit to Ubisoft. I mean, I think a lot of companies on their recent earnings calls gave lip service to NFTs in games, especially the AAA publishers kind of were like, well, that sounds like an interesting idea that we're looking at. But Ubisoft said that and then kind of followed through very quickly. So I have to give them a ton of credit. Clearly, they had been kind of having this in the works for a while. And I would note, this isn't the first time Ubisoft has been pretty forward thinking in terms of adopting new platforms, new technology. They were early to the Switch. They were early to Stadia, rest in peace. They early on subscription. So this is kind of a trend with Ubisoft that they do kind of try to adopt new technologies. So kudos to them. Kind of just wanted to throw that out there first.
No, it's a good point, right? Because literally every gaming company said they were going to do something metaverse related, right? Literally every single one. Ubisoft here sort of really following through in a very tangible way, right? This is something that they're launching. They've named a specific game. Mm-hmm. They have a specific date. It's December 9th. So by the time you guys listen to this or watch this, it'll already be out. Actually, depending where you are, because it comes out later in some countries. But fundamentally they're putting their money where their mouth is here, and they're working, by the way, with Tezos, worth mentioning,
Mhm.
for their proof of stake network, and this is the blockchain underlying it, right?
Which
So,
I thought was interesting. It's not one you typically hear. It's not one of the most common ones, I don't think. Um,
well, Tezos as a company, I would say, has had a pretty big, has made a big splash. They sponsor F1 now, right? Like
yeah,
they're definitely making waves in the space. I guess the question is, do you like this, right? Is this enough from Ubisoft to back up what they said they were going to do? Is this a good first step?
I
Do
think
you
it's a
see
good
business
start.
advantages here? Like, will they make more money on Ghost
I think
Recon?
it's a good start. I mean, the question that I was going to kind of pose, I hate to answer a question with a question, but I'm curious what your thoughts are that they started with a game that's already out there, that
Yeah,
already has a player base. I think I kind of went back and forth. I think it probably is good because one of the critiques we've always had with blockchain games so far is that they kind of put the blockchain part before the games part and they don't make a game that's fun. Now, people who follow Ubisoft or played Ghost Recon Breakpoint might make a joke that, well, Ghost Recon Breakpoint wasn't very fun to begin with, but at least it's a game that they're adding NFTs to, which I kind of commend them for that.
yeah.
But then does that alienate the fan base? And does it kind of like, are you risking throwing this in too late to kind of an economy that's already working? Um, would it have been better to start with a new experience that's something that's unique to the blockchain rather than just throwing this into a game that already exists? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I mean, doesn't it kind of prove the short term point? I think that and I think you also have been making, which is blockchain and NFTs as they intersect gaming can't just be for the sake of calling it a blockchain game or an NFT game, right? There has to be some improvement or benefit to the game and gamer in some way for this to be really interesting in my mind. What I like here is what I like about them using an existing game is it sort of forces them to think about how does this make the game better, right? Because it's not just
Mhm.
enough to say we're launching an NFT game and it could be the crappiest, most unfun game ever, right? But because they're calling it an NFT game or a blockchain based game, like it'll get a bunch of attention. Here, they're taking an existing game, whether you like the game or not, you think the game is good or not, is not sort of material in my mind, right? And saying, look, we can make it better by fill in the blank. Now, where I'm unclear is did they fill in the blank there well enough to make this a compelling value proposition for the gamer? And therefore, I think this is going to make money, right? Are people going to buy more cosmetics in Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon as a consequence of this announcement? And like, if you were the analyst covering Ubisoft, do you increase your projections for this game, for this title? Do like,
No, I don't think so. I mean, one, I'd be curious to know how big that player base is now because I know it had a very tough launch. I do think this is very much them just doing a test and kind of getting some data. So I'm not. I don't think it's going to have a very material business impact on Ubisoft, but I do think it's a good idea for them to be trying. Two things that I think are interesting that I kind of noted. One, maybe not as surprising as the other. First, that these are cosmetic only,
yeah.
which maybe that's not shocking because they're basically microtransactions. But I do think with play to earn, a lot of these things can become play to win, or pay to win. Sorry, just given one of the benefits a lot of times with these things is kind of the uniqueness. I think if there's a power element to it, like, hey, I got the best gun in the game and there's only 5 of them, and I can now be better because I have this gun. I think that adds a lot of value. So I think that creates a lot of problems as well. But I do think that's probably where things will eventually head, where there will be some power element to these things. I don't know if you
So
disagree
is this
completely
is
with
this
that.
too little and not interesting in your mind,
It's too little.
Jeff?
It's interesting, but too little. The other thing I was going to
Like,
mention,
fundamentally, it's no different than just a microtransaction and a cosmetic, right? Other than the fact that you could potentially
go
sell
sell it
it
on an
on a
exchange.
third party site, which doesn't really exist yet, right? And there's no, it's,
Are
I,
they not? Is it not on any exchanges yet?
I don't actually, I don't know,
Yeah,
but
I don't know.
I don't, I guess the question is like, is there going to be resale value in these cosmetics?
Well,
Um,
that was one thing I was thinking when I was looking at the announcement. I was like, what should I almost was looking at buying like the Tezos coin because I was like, something here. This is a first, right? This is a
yep.
unique first in a triple A. I was like, maybe you do want to buy one of these because again, there's only one first ever. So there could be some value in owning the first sort of triple A, NFT. Same way there's, you made the first NFT in esports, and now that's worth,
Millions.
millions. Uh,
Can we hold
the
on? I want to introduce here the second story, which is totally
But
tied to the
before we
first.
do that,
Sorry, yeah,
before we do
yeah,
that, the other thing I'll mention that I wanted to get your opinion on, I noticed they made it 18 and up, so you could only buy this if you're 18 and up.
yeah.
I don't. Is that the same thing in Axie and other blockchain games? Is that because of some gambling element? Like, why do you think that is the case, and is that going to be the case moving forward for all blockchain games? Because that clearly limits the TAM. If you're kind of saying, hey, only 18 and up can purchase these things.
Now I know Axie Infinity does have an 18 plus age rating. I don't know if they age check you though, right? Like where you have to
I
declare
guess you
your
could just say
age.
I am 18, but still
Yeah,
that
right.
it
It's
does limit some people if they don't want to lie.
the reality is
Yeah.
it's all self, right? Like no one's asking, as far as I know, not Axie Infinity, not anywhere yet is asking you to give your driver's license or like birth certificate or something. So there's no age verification. There's a self-reported age check. And at that point, like, is it really limiting anyone? It
Yeah.
feels more like all of these companies mostly just covering their behinds from a legal liability standpoint, right? Like, well, they reported 18, so it's not our issue, it's not our problem.
Fair enough.
Um, but it's a good point, and I think as regulation or potentially comes into the space, potentially, right? Those become bigger and bigger issues, and I think how companies act early on will have some bearing on the longer term sort of viability of these platforms. Now, I think what was most interesting about this story, and you're the one that picked up on this, and I love this, is one day after, literally one day after that press release came out, this story came up, and I'll read the headline here. Ubisoft delists its NFT announcement as YouTube dislikes top 22,000. Fewer than 5% of viewers liked the video explaining the Ubisoft Quartz platform. That's the name of the platform we just discussed. And it says here Ubisoft has delisted its announced trailer for its Ubisoft Quartz platform following overwhelming backlash that saw it receiving a dislike to like ratio of around 20 to 1. So 800 were likes, 15,466 were dislikes. It was delisted. And so the reaction from, call it, fans or people who follow Ubisoft, I mean, Jeff, is it safe to say that the reaction was overwhelmingly negative?
Overwhelmingly negative and very surprised. Like, I don't know if you feel the same way as I do. Like, this to me was incredibly surprising. And maybe this is a moment where we need to like take a step back, to see the forest from the trees or whatever that the expression is, and recognize that the portion of people who are diving really deep into these blockchain games and even just crypto is still so early where it's such a small percentage of people, and a lot of the broader gaming community and the broader world looks at these still as sort of scammy, kind of the stuff we talked about in the last episode with Phil Spencer. Kind of still looks at these and says, "Hey, this is a cash grab. I'm maybe getting scammed in some way." And part of that might be Ubisoft's reputation a little bit, and kind of this game specific reputation with some microtransaction issues when it first came out. But I do think I am a little bit surprised that it seems the community viewed this as a little bit of a cash grab and maybe just them throwing in this buzzword or this mechanic for no reason. Though I am surprised because I would have thought that there would have been more intersection between gamers and kind of people who are crypto enthusiasts. And I would have thought the community of this game would have gotten excited being the first kind of AAA game to implement this. So this one is a surprise to me.
Well, and this is what I'm curious, like some of the theories you've got. I think the one you mentioned around Ubisoft, on our sister podcast, on the Business of Esports live stream, we had a discussion around. There was this poll done, and Ubisoft was the most hated gaming brand on Twitter or whatever, right? Like Ubisoft has challenges with their brand as it relates to gamers. I don't know why so much hate around this announcement, though, right? Like fundamentally, it has no bearing or effect on players of the game, really, right? Like they lose nothing. And
Right. If you
so,
don't want to participate, it's not like it became
yeah,
pay to win. Like, God forbid they had done that, like I had mentioned before, they really would have gotten backlash. Like, you don't have to participate in this at all. It's like, if you want to buy this cosmetic, buy it. If not, don't. So yeah, I'm surprised.
this is why I don't fully understand the backlash. And so as I'm thinking about this, one of the theories is it just, is it already fatigue around the buzzword, right? Like, is it feeling like Ubisoft, or do players feel like Ubisoft is trying to cash in some way, and they don't spend the time to sort of understand what Ubisoft's actually doing here? Is it that Ubisoft didn't communicate this well in terms of the benefits to the player and how it's basically optional, or you know what I mean? Like, where's the failure, the business failure here?
It's actually, it's 100% fascinating, because this kind of visceral sort of dislike, like, this isn't neutral. This is, 95, 20 to 1 dislike to like. You don't see that often. So it would be fascinating to see some market research. Like, I do wonder if maybe blockchain gaming has gotten this stigma from the broader gaming community. Like, hey, these guys aren't kind of approaching it the right way. Almost like when I know you're going to kill me by bringing this up, but kind of the authenticity word that gets thrown around in esports a lot. Like, when a sponsor, or even in gaming more broadly, if a sponsor or an entity comes into the ecosystem and isn't authentic, or seen to be sort of paying their dues, or kind of approaching it in the right way, they get ostracized. Like, have we gotten to the point maybe where the broader gaming community views blockchain gaming and crypto as sort of like, well, that's not gaming. They're the outsiders. They're just trying to scam us. I don't, that's a really broad,
Yeah,
sweeping statement that I don't think we should feel comfortable making off
yeah.
just this. But it would be fascinating if someone like a YouGov would do some sort of consumer insight around kind of gamers' just perception of blockchain, and kind of these gaming experiences.
I'm curious, if you're at Activision Blizzard and you see this happen, right? Or you're at EA and you see this happen. Do you become a little gun shy in terms of your own blockchain slash NFT slash sort of metaverse related announcements? Like, do you sort of step back and go, maybe we should wait, maybe we should see how this plays out a bit more? Or do you go, hey, this is just Ubisoft, no one likes Ubisoft, like we're still going to go ahead with our plans, right? Like,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely a data point that you would look at. I don't think you scrap your plans just on this one data point. There's a clear the bigger picture and a lot more data to look at. But I do think it's something that you take pause, because if the reaction is this negative, the worst thing you want to do in one of these games that you have a large active player base that you're effectively monetizing really well for the long term, is alienate them, and get people to leave the game because you introduced a new mechanic that they didn't want. So I do think, particularly for a game, if we're talking about a game like FIFA or Grand Theft Auto, things that are Call of Duty, games that are literally $1 billion cash cows, yeah, you're gonna think long and hard if now you're seeing this kind of visceral negative reaction, for sure.
yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out, right? Because the person who takes the first step sometimes takes the most risk, right? Like, I never try and read into this too much, because anytime you're breaking new ground, you're going to have haters, you're going to have people who just don't like change of any kind, right? Like, to me, I think that's a big part of this. And you compound that with Ubisoft's sort of not so great reputation, and you get this perfect storm of dislikes on YouTube. I also understand, I guess, why YouTube wants to remove the dislike button uh,
Yeah.
for moments like this. But anyways, let's move on. I want to touch on a different story here, Jeff, and that is, and this one's definitely a rabbit hole that I'm sure we will go down over and over on this podcast. But it's a great way to sort of introduce the idea. And this is from the New York Times, so definitely mainstream media here, which I love. They're talking about the metaverse. And the headline here is Getting Married in the Metaverse. The subheadline says one couple's recent nuptials in the virtual world known as the Metaverse showcase the possibilities of having a wedding unfettered by the bounds of reality. It goes on to say that people are having Zoom weddings, people are getting married, and have always for a while now been getting married in games like World of Warcraft, Animal Crossing, etc. But one particular section here I really like. They talked about how one company creates digital planning tools for weddings they're investing in the metaverse by creating virtual versions of real world event spaces like the Plaza Hotel in New York. So if you want to do something like crazy and wild in the metaverse, you can, right? You can go have the crazy over the top wedding at the Plaza Hotel, which I think is interesting. Um, the big question I have for you is, how quickly do you think we'll see, right? The wedding business is huge, multi-billion dollar industry, right? People spend lots of money on their weddings. How quickly do you think we'll see traditional industries sort of move into the metaverse in some way, transition, into more digital offerings? And what do you think the reception will be from customers? Like, are we going to see 1% of weddings, for example, go into the metaverse, or are we going to see 20%?
Probably 1% of 1%. I think, it will take time, just like with any adoption of technology. I mean, I'm kind of laughing because I'm imagining like grandparents and great grandparents, like trying to figure out how to get into the metaverse. Like that's a problem that eventually is going to have to get fixed, but it might get fixed by literally us aging up to be those grandparents and great grandparents. Cause it's a hard barrier to imagine them having to figure, they can't even figure out FaceTime. Like it's going to be hard for them to figure out Roblox and or whatever metaverse you're talking about. But from a broader picture, zooming out from the wedding industry, I do think you're seeing and you are going to continue to see large sections of the economy that is currently in the IRL world shift into the digital world, and you'll have kind of representations of similar things. Like clearly, there's been a lot of talk recently about concerts in the metaverse. Not even just recently, for a couple of years now, concerts in digital spaces, and a lot of artists have had a lot of success with that. So just having these events in digital worlds, I think you're going to see big swaths of different industries move in there. Weddings is an interesting one. I mean, part of me thinks like that would be something like that might be, unless you're an early adopter, like one of the later things to move, just because your
Hmm.
wedding is such a special day for people. Um, you know, I'll say myself included. Oh, my wife will kill me, but so it's one of those things where I imagine that's a thing where you're going to want people to come together, sort of in real life. Um,
But
but there are also limitations to real life where we saw it clearly during COVID. Like that was the only way you could get married. If you're spread out or costs, it's a lot more cost effective. So I can see you can convince me of a lot of the positives of a virtual wedding. I just think it's going to take some time to get significant adoption.
I'm curious what you think of the following thesis, and this is totally off the cuff. I actually I didn't think about this before, but like, will we see sort of cannibalization of industries and sort of real life things, right, by the metaverse in areas where the price tags are the highest? Like, part of me thinks that where you have very high price tags, this is maybe the most ripe for sort of a metaverse equivalent, right? Like sim racing is one. I had a great conversation today with someone about sim racing, right? Where not everyone can afford to race a Ferrari, right? But
Hmm.
a lot of people can afford to have a sim rig and a VR headset and get, 90% of the experience. Not everyone can afford to get married at the Plaza Hotel, but the cost of doing that in the metaverse, once you've built that Plaza model, to be able to put people into it is not that costly, right? So in some ways, it democratizes these very high end kind of out of reach experiences. And I don't know if you think, like,
So
the thesis I want to put forward is maybe the most expensive things are the first that will get sort of metaverse equivalents.
so I think that's a really interesting thought, and could very well be right. My only pushback is more from an economic standpoint than a metaverse and gaming standpoint, where it's like a lot of these experience and events are probably sought after because they're expensive, right? Like the term Veblen good, like it's like almost like there's more demand for it because it's expensive. Like everyone wants to get married at the plaza because only like 50 people a year can get married at the plaza. It's
Yep.
just a building, like it's not that special, other than the fact that you can't get married there unless you are a billionaire, kind of thing.
Yep.
So that's my only question of to kind of push back on your thesis is like, are those experiences so special and sought after because they're sort of scarce? And by putting them into the metaverse, like if you could get married at the virtual plaza or like the virtual, I don't know, something even more crazy, like you're floating through space, like that would probably be maybe
Yeah, I see
cooler.
what you're saying. The bounding ourselves by real life experiences may not be the best business model.
Yeah.
Um, all right, let's look. I think it's fascinating. I want it to be a topic we revisit regularly, like the effect of the metaverse on other industries, right? Because to me, that's that's the exciting piece of this whole thing, which is as the metaverse sort of industry grows, what is it swallowing, right? Like what is getting converted to digital experiences versus real life? And it'll be interesting to see which industries fall first, right? Is it
I think that's
education?
a
Is
great
it tourism? Is it
it's a great point, and it's also really important for investors. People who are listening to this, kind of thinking about where maybe to make money investing in this space. Obviously, there's some pretty clear metaverse plays that we've talked about, and we will talk about all the time on this podcast. But kind of those second derivative, hey, well, who is the metaverse going to hurt, sort of thing, or maybe who is adjacent that you wouldn't think of as a metaverse play, but kind of touches it because of some tangential reason. I think that's actually really interesting to come back to.
so? I want to end. We have a bunch of stuff, but I want to end this episode, Jeff, on the article we teased at the beginning here, and that's from PC Gamer. And the headline here was total clickbait, right? Just for the record, I think this author is completely wrong. I think they don't know what they're talking about. I'm happy to debate them at any time, but they're totally wrong about this. This is total clickbait. The headline here is "The Metaverse is Bullshit," and the subheadline says, "You're not losing your mind. It really does just sound like a worse version of the internet." And he makes some points. I don't know if you wanted to touch on specific ones here, Jeff, but I'll just
Well,
mention some of them.
you can mention there was a couple that I wanted to say where I thought were actually decent criticisms of, and one in particular, right? And then really, I don't know if you scroll down.
Well, let me just mention this one. So he
Yeah,
says the
you
metaverse is
mentioned.
bullshit because it already exists and it's called the internet. That's his first argument. His second argument is the metaverse is bullshit because tech moguls miss the part where cyberpunk is dystopian. And the third criticism he has is the metaverse is bullshit because its promised cross compatibility doesn't actually work. And then fourth, he says the metaverse is bullshit because no one can actually explain why it's better. So those are the 4 points he makes, and I'm curious where you thought some of them had merit and where you thought some of them.
Yeah. So the one, and I think those headlines don't; those are a little bit clickbaity. I think there's a couple more nuanced points that he makes sort of throughout that were maybe a little bit better. But the one that I think is the best point that I want to probably dive into the most is really the issue of interoperability, where kind of the metaverse and what the metaverse is today, where kind of melds with blockchain, is this concept where you get ownership of the items you have in game, and then the blockchain allows you to buy and sell them, so you own it. You could sell it once, let's say you were playing the game, you decide to stop playing the game, you could sell your item, which is a positive. That is definitely a benefit. But what sort of the promise of the future is this interoperability where it's, hey, I bought a gun in Call of Duty. I want to go play Battlefield. I can bring my gun because I spent all this money in Call of Duty, upgrading it, buying it, building it. I can go bring it to Battlefield. That that world does not exist currently. And I think there are a lot of challenges to how that world will exist in the future, given they're separate companies built on separate engines, very foundational thing. So I think that is an interesting point that he makes that is important to sort of figure out.
Yeah, I can guarantee you the author here was born after after the year 2000, most likely, or like mid to late 90s, because fundamentally, I think he doesn't understand how the internet itself evolved. Right? He says, "Oh, it's no metaverse is no different than the internet." Well, the reality is, I think for even for the metaverse, as exciting as it is, there are still technology hurdles that haven't been solved. Right? So he says it's bullshit because its promised cross compatibility doesn't actually work. Well, I mean, how can he say that, right? Literally, no one has yet proposed any kind of standards, right? It's like saying in the 1970s that the internet doesn't work because there's no cross compatibility. Well, that's not fair, because at some point people got together and agreed that TCP/IP and HTML and some of these standards were going to be the foundations, and built on top of that. And I think as this industry evolves, similar things are going to happen. So, like, to me, that's such a weak argument that just because it doesn't exist today doesn't mean it won't exist ever, right? I think for
Mhm.
for the promise of the metaverse to come true, cross compatibility will have to be a thing, and I believe we will solve it because it's to everyone's benefit. To your point, right?
Yep.
The argument he makes about tech moguls missed the part where cyberpunk is dystopian. I mean, that's such a fluff argument, right? Like, in some ways, the metaverse is going to be dystopian because cyberpunk is dystopian. Like, I could easily point to Star Trek, where holodecks are as close to a metaverse as anyone I think has come to portraying them. And Star Trek's totally utopian, not dystopian. And so, he's wrong on that point.
There's a
Jeff, were
piece
you going to
that
jump in?
Yeah, well, there's a piece that I wanted to bring up where it's talking about advertising, and basically the premise is essentially like, is the metaverse just going to become advertising thrown at you in your face, and really just like an immersive ad essentially. And there's a quote from Tim Sweeney, so I'm curious to kind of get if we can find it. It's somewhere in the article. Just get your thoughts
My
on that.
response to that is where do people go today where it's not being thrown in your face, right? Like, is the reality. It says in September 2021, Washington
Yeah.
Post interview, Tim Sweeney imagined the future of advertising. Says a car maker who wants to make a presence in the metaverse isn't going to run ads. They're going to drop their car into the world in real time and you'll be able to drive it around. And they're going to work with lots of content creators with different experiences to ensure their car is playable here and there and that it's receiving the attention it deserves. And I think Tim's totally right there, right? I think that's a fantastic point of how the metaverse is fundamentally better than the internet or the next evolution of it, and the kinds of experiences it can drive for users, for advertisers, for everybody is really compelling. I don't know if you had thoughts on that
No,
or
that's fair. I just think his points around advertising are interesting ones, and ones we've kind of talked about a little bit on prior episodes, where it's like having brands come into the metaverse. Does it kind of just become this dystopian shopping mall where you just have brands shoving virtual things in your face? Now, as I'm saying that, I realize you could basically describe the internet or social media as that to some extent, very much so. But it's just something that I think we'll probably continue to talk about. The last kind of interesting quote that I pulled up when I was reading it really actually dovetails a lot with what we were just saying, and I want to hear your thoughts on it. He goes, "So much development on the metaverse is focusing on recreating worse versions of things we already have in the real world." And I can't help but think about the virtual wedding as, is that just a worse version of a thing we have
no,
in the real
it's
world?
better. It's way better. You could get wasted in a virtual wedding and it has no impact on the next day, right? To your point, you can do the wedding in space. How can you do that in the real world? Like, untethered from your meat body, right? Your limbs and your what you can do in a metaverse, the risks you can take, the things you can like experience, to me far exceeds what is possible in real life. This is like I would argue, the next step in human evolution, even, right? It's the digitization of our being. Ray Kurzweil called this the singularity, where soul and digital meet. And I think that it's exciting. This author that is totally out to lunch, doesn't understand the opportunity here or why it's exciting. So on that note, I think that wraps up this episode of the Meta Business Podcast. Jeff, thank you as always. To our listeners, make sure you guys, if you like the show, send us feedback, subscribe. It's available everywhere now. It took a bit to get us on, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, literally everywhere you get your podcast content. We also put the videos up on YouTube if you prefer to watch. So make sure you check it out everywhere. We really would appreciate any feedback, and tell your friends about the show. If you're working in or around the metaverse or gaming or crypto, we really, really would love your feedback. And on that note, Jeff, thank you. We will see all of you guys next week.
Thank you all.
Thanks for watching this episode of Meta Business. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Also, make sure to leave a review if you love the content. This is a Meta TV series, the world's first and only media platform focused on metaverse content and themes. So make sure to follow all of the other Meta TV social channels for more shows just like this.